Protests rocked Iran after a slowdown in recent weeks, while demonstrations against austerity measures in Suriname turned violent. North Korea fired a long-range missile as South Korea and the US planned drills. Kosovo and Serbia remain on a medium simmer. New Zealand's death toll from Cyclone Gabrielle is expected to rise. A grand jury says witnesses in the Donald Trump election meddling probe in Georgia might have lied under oath. Nikki Haley will challenge her former boss for the GOP presidential nomination as far-right Republican groups surge in Michigan. Trump's lawyer in the classified documents probe hired his own lawyer. Members of the Portuguese Catholic Church sexually abused more than 4,800 children over the past 70 years. Speaking of Portugal, say goodbye to the golden visa. Israel's Christians say they're the target of growing harassment. A Dutch World War II archive will name suspected Nazi collaborators online. A security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin was sentenced to 13 years in prison for sharing sensitive data with a Russian attaché. And it's been a miserable week for German commercial aviation. Welcome to the latest episode of News This Week. We've got all the top stories and developments of the week, so sit back, relax, and get ready for a dose of current events. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates and insights. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, unexpectedly announced she would resign, after more than 8 years in office. Ms. Sturgeon has campaigned tirelessly for Scottish independence, a cause that Scots rejected in a referendum in 2014. Her efforts to ask voters the same question again, hoping for a different answer, have been rebuffed by the courts. She had been pilloried over the state of Scotland's public services, and rode with some of her own party over transgender issues. She will stay in office until a successor is found. Ukraine is planning a spring counteroffensive, for which it wants more, heavier and longer-range weapons. The call came as Western leaders met in Munich to assess the war. The death toll from the earthquakes that hit southern Turkey and northern Syria passed 42,000. Survivors were still being pulled from the wreckage, a week after the tremors, but hope is dim for those still trapped. Critics lambasted Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Turkey's president, for policies that allowed construction firms to avoid safety measures that would have made more buildings earthquake-proof. He faces re-election this year. America temporarily eased sanctions on Syria to allow earthquake aid into the country. New border crossings were opened to expedite the transfer of supplies. Egypt, Jordan and the United Arab Emirates have been leading the relief effort. Syria's President Bashar al-Assad allowed earthquake aid to enter rebel-held territory where survivors have been left almost entirely to themselves. Analysts are confident that he will want something in return. Supporting the home team, India's government told the Supreme Court that a panel should investigate the truthfulness or otherwise of the research report that shot a hole in the Adani Group. Smriti Irani, Minister for Women and Child Development, attacked George Soros for saying Modi's and Gautam Adani's fates are intertwined, as did Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar. The President of Moldova, Maia Sandu, said that Russia was trying to overthrow her pro-EU government by infiltrating the country and stirring up protests. Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky, says that Ukraine has uncovered a Russian plot to destabilize Moldova. The embattled Moldovan Prime Minister stepped down, and was replaced by Dorin Rasian, who was the president's security advisor and is also pro-Western. Moldova applied to join the EU last year. Another journalist in Russia was sentenced to prison under fake news laws for reporting on Russia's bombing of Mariupol in Ukraine last March. Maria Ponomarenko was sent to a penal colony for 6 years for social media posts describing an airstrike on a theater full of children. The Brothers of Italy, the senior party in the Italian governing coalition, handily won regional elections in Lazio and Lombardy, strengthening the hand of the Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni. The right-wing coalition's victory in Lazio, around Rome, turfed out the center-left, which had held power there for a decade. A week after shooting down a Chinese spy balloon, America downed several unidentified objects flying over North America. It did not specify what the objects were. China accused America of having flown balloons into its airspace more than 10 times during the past year. The hunger crisis in North Korea has worsened, according to the South Korean government. Even the army's food rations have been cut, for the first time in 2 decades. North Korea, a communist dictatorship, has long mismanaged its food supply. In the 1990s a famine killed at least 200,000 and perhaps as many as 3 million people. Tax officials in India raided the BBC's offices in Delhi and Mumbai, weeks after the broadcaster released a documentary blaming Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, for failing to prevent massacres of Muslims while he was in charge of the state of Gujarat. The documentary was banned in India. Critics of the ruling Hindu Nationalist Party have often run into trouble with the tax man. New Zealand declared a state of emergency as Cyclone Gabrielle battered the country's north, causing widespread flooding and landslides. It was also hit by an earthquake of magnitude 6.1. Huge protests continued in Israel against proposed reforms put forward by Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, that would curtail the power of the Supreme Court to overturn laws passed by the Knesset. Isaac Herzog, Israel's president, said many people see the reform as a threat to Israeli democracy and warned of a societal and constitutional collapse. Meanwhile, the government passed a law to strip Israeli Arabs convicted of terrorism of their citizenship. Police in Tunisia arrested more prominent critics of the president, Kais Saied, including a senior official in the main opposition party, Ennahda, which styles itself Muslim Democratic. Police have also arrested a former finance minister, judges and a diplomat in the crackdown. Joe Biden said he expects to speak with Xi Jinping about the balloon that the US shot down, as the search for other objects that fighter jets downed was called off. US-China diplomatic communications remain open, military communications do not. The White House said there was no indication of aliens or extraterrestrial activity. We had to ask. A Russian frigate, the Admiral Gorshkov, docked in Cape Town ahead of joint military drills with South Africa and China. The ship, displaying the Z insignia of Russian troops in Ukraine, carries a Zircon hypersonic missile that Russia intends to test in the exercise. The mayor of Cape Town, who comes from the opposition Democratic Alliance, said the vessel was not welcome. Last month Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, visited South Africa. The government says it is neutral between Ukraine and Russia. Jair Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, said he would return to the country in March to lead a right-wing movement. Mr. Bolsonaro, who has been living in Florida since December, has not yet conceded defeat after Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, a leftist, beat him in an election in October. Mr. Bolsonaro reiterated baseless insinuations that the election was biased against him. Nikki Haley announced that she would run to be the Republican candidate for the American presidency in 2024. The former governor of South Carolina is the first person to challenge Donald Trump, who has said he will run again. Ron DeSantis, the Republican Mr. Trump fears most, has yet to throw his hat into the ring. Joe Biden appointed Lael Brainerd to head his National Economic Council, which coordinates economic policy. Ms. Brainerd is currently vice chairwoman of the Federal Reserve. She once argued that the central bank should expand its remit to encompass climate change. Renewable energy is central to the huge infrastructure plans announced by Mr. Biden. Dianne Feinstein decided not to seek another term in the United States Senate. The 89-year-old was first elected to her California seat in 1992 and is the longest-serving female senator ever. She became mayor of San Francisco in 1978, after the assassination of her predecessor, George Moscone. She has pressed for strict gun controls, helping to pass an assault weapons ban in 1994. Adam Schiff and Katie Porter are among the Democratic bigwigs vying to replace her. America's annual inflation rate dipped to 6.4% in January, from 6.5% in December. Markets had expected a sharper fall. Food prices were up by 10.1% year-on-year, and energy prices by 8.7%, which all point to further interest rate rises from the Federal Reserve. In Britain, inflation stood at 10.1% in January, down from 10.5% but still stubbornly high. Inflation has not been falling as fast there as in America and the EU, though the Bank of England thinks this will change when lower wholesale energy prices start feeding through to consumers. The Japanese government nominated Ueda Kazuo to be the next governor of the Bank of Japan. Speculation has swirled for months about who would replace Kuroda Haruhiko, who steps down in April, but Mr. Ueda was a surprise choice. He is a respected academic economist. His appointment breaks the tradition of selecting someone from within the central bank or finance ministry. Markets will be watching closely for any sign that Mr. Ueda intends to adjust the BOJ's ultra-loose policy. The delicate balancing act facing Mr. Ueda was highlighted by the latest GDP figures for Japan. The economy grew by 0.6% at an annualized rate in the final quarter of 2022, avoiding recession but a slower rate than had been expected after the easing of COVID-19 restrictions. GDP expanded by 1.1% for the whole year. Air India said it would buy 470 planes from Airbus and Boeing to revamp its fleet, the biggest ever order from a single airline. The carrier was privatized by the government after 70 years of state ownership, returning to the Tata Group, whose founder started the airline in 1932. The order includes wide-bodied, long-distance jets, which will enable Air India to compete with Gulf Airlines for Indian long-haul passengers and fly directly to America and Europe. Nelson Peltz ended his brief campaign to secure a seat on Disney's board and force it to change. The activist investor terminated his proxy battle after the company announced a restructuring of its business, which includes placing Disney+, its main streaming channel, in a new entertainment division overseeing all content decisions. Mr. Peltz's firm said the new strategy was a win for shareholders. After months of rumors, Ford confirmed that it is cutting its workforce in Europe. The carmaker said that 3,800 jobs would go, accounting for 11% of its staff in the region. Most of the cuts will be in Germany and Britain, as Ford prepares to ramp up production of electric vehicles, which need fewer workers to make than petrol-powered cars. In its latest forecast, the International Energy Agency said that the share of renewable energy in the world's power generation will rise from 29% to 35% in 2025. This means that, although the demand for electricity is expected to keep growing, and 70% of that increase will come from China, India and Southeast Asia, emissions from the power sector will plateau. That transition to renewable energy is still a work in progress. Glencore reported a record annual profit of $34 billion, more than half of which came from coal production. The mining and commodities trading company benefited from soaring coal prices amid Russia's war in Ukraine. David Malpass announced his resignation as head of the World Bank, a year before his term expires. Mr. Malpass, who was nominated for the job by Donald Trump, has been under fire for dodging questions about climate change. Airbnb recorded net income of $1.9 billion for last year, its first annual profit. The property rentals company has seen a surge in bookings from international tourists. During the pandemic, people faced restrictions limiting their travel. Rental prices are still significantly higher than before the outbreak of COVID, however, raising the issue of affordability. Airbnb is tackling this by increasing the supply of available rooms. The post-pandemic company has seen a rise in twats, people who work in the office on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. Data from WFH research show that the new normal for working patterns is costing Manhattan $12.4 billion a year in lost income, as the average worker spends $4,661 less on meals, shopping and entertainment near the office. Sales growth in Manhattan now lags behind other parts of New York City. In Britain, office workers now have fewer pubs in which to drown their sorrows. Research by A. Hacker Young, a professional services firm, found an 83% rise in pubs and bars filing for insolvency last year. Customers are tightening their belts and costs are rising for pub owners. If that wasn't enough to send you crying into your beer, rail strikes are deterring people from traveling into town for a night out. And engaging. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll be back next week with more of the latest and most important news from around the globe. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our website and social media pages for more updates and insights. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel News Around World for more updates and insights on the latest news from around the globe. See you next week for another episode.